Let me ask you something. What's the worst thing you think a conqueror can do? Steal your land, burn your city, kill your king? No. Genghis Khan went further. Much further. He didn't just want power over your body. He wanted power over your bloodline, your future, even your unborn children. Historians say he fathered so many children that 1 out of every 200 men alive today might carry his DNA. Creepy, right? Now imagine how he achieved that. Torture, abduction, sexual violence used as a weapon of war. This isn't the Genghis Khan of your school books, the great military genius. This is the nightmare version, the one history tried to whisper about in the shadows. So before you scroll away, let me challenge you. Would you dare to look at the darker side of the world's most feared conqueror? Or will you close your eyes and pretend it never happened? If you think you can stomach the truth, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear will change how you see history forever. In the harsh, windswept steppes of 12th century Mongolia, survival was never guaranteed. Life was dictated by hunger, weather, and betrayal. Out here, children were not born into innocence. They were born into conflict, and among them, one boy would rise to shape the fate of continents. Temujin, who would later be remembered as Genghis Khan, he was born around 1162, the son of a minor tribal chief. But fate struck early. When Temujin was only 9 years old, his father was poisoned by a rival clan, leaving his family abandoned. Suddenly stripped of protection, Temujin, his mother, and his siblings were cast out to starve on the margins of the steppe. What followed was not the nurturing childhood of legend, but the slow, grinding horror of deprivation. His family scoured frozen rivers for fish, picked wild roots, and gnawed at the scraps of animals left behind by wolves. The experience forged something merciless within him, a deep hatred of weakness. In his earliest years, Temujin learned that compassion brought death, while control brought survival. Even among his own siblings, rivalry turned brutal. In a fit of anger over food, Temujin killed his half-brother Börte, a chilling act that revealed a truth about him: family bonds mattered less than dominance. But Temujin's trials did not end there. He was soon captured by a rival clan, shackled to a wooden yoke, and held as a prisoner. For days, he endured the humiliation of bondage, treated as nothing more than a servant. Escape came through cunning, not mercy. One sympathetic guard helped him flee, but the memory of captivity burned into his mind a lesson he would never forget. To be conquered was worse than death. As Temujin grew into manhood, his rise to power was not merely through alliances and battles, but through the violent control of women's lives. At 16, he married Börte, the woman who would remain his chief wife throughout his life. But happiness was fleeting. Almost immediately after their union, Börte was abducted by the Merkit tribe, a symbolic assault meant to humiliate Temujin and destroy his fragile authority. For months, Börte endured captivity, likely treated as a spoil of war, her body subjected to the brutal customs of steppe rivalries. Temujin's fury was relentless. With borrowed allies, he waged war to reclaim her, slaughtering Merkits without hesitation. Though Börte was restored to him, the trauma of abduction carried into her marriage. Their firstborn son's paternity was questioned, a scar that marked both her life and Temujin's sense of possession. From this moment, the pattern was set. Conquest was not just territorial. It was sexual, personal, and absolute. The brutality of these early years shaped Temujin's philosophy. In the steppe, loyalty was fragile, betrayal constant. To prevent defiance, he demanded submission, from warriors, from tribes, and from women. Those who resisted were punished with annihilation. Entire clans that stood against him were slaughtered, their leaders executed in grotesque rituals. Victories were celebrated not only in blood, but in the forced marriages and enslavement of captured women, who became symbols of his dominance. Temujin also cloaked his cruelty in divine destiny. According to Mongol tradition, his family traced descent to a blue wolf and a doe, mythic ancestors who sanctified his conquests. For Temujin, every act of domination was not merely strategy, it was cosmic right. He believed himself chosen by the eternal sky, Tengri, to rule over all beneath heaven. This conviction transformed his violence from personal vengeance into an ideology of empire. The horror of his rise cannot be separated from the culture that produced him. Among Mongol tribes, power was measured not only in herds and land but in the number of wives and concubines a man possessed. Women were bargaining chips, trophies, and tools of political consolidation. Temujin, scarred by the loss of Börte, sought to ensure that no man would ever hold power over his household again. Captured women from defeated clans were distributed to his generals, their bodies used to secure loyalty and to erase enemy bloodlines. This systematic use of sexual violence was not incidental, it was central to the machinery of conquest. By the time Temujin began uniting the Mongol tribes under his iron rule, he was already a figure of terror. His punishments were infamous. Rival leaders were executed by having molten silver poured into their eyes and throats. Dissenters were cut down to the last child. He was both feared and revered, his reputation spreading like wildfire across the steppe. The boy who once starved in exile had become a warlord who wielded starvation, captivity, and violation as weapons of his own. And yet, the greatest horror was not simply in the acts themselves, but in their consequences. The world that Temujin created, the empire that would stretch from China to Europe, was built on these foundations of terror. His conquests would leave tens of millions dead. Entire civilizations were scarred by the shadow of his armies. His descendants, born of countless seized women, carried forward a legacy of both empire and trauma. What began with a starving boy, abandoned and betrayed, ended with a conqueror who reshaped the earth through fear. When Temujin emerged from the chaos of tribal rivalries to become Genghis Khan, he understood something most warlords did not. Killing in battle was not enough. To build an empire across continents, he needed obedience, swift, unquestioning, and absolute. For that, he turned to terror. Mongol armies advanced with a speed the world had never seen. But it was not speed alone that shattered cities. It was reputation. Stories of annihilation spread across the Silk Roads faster than horses could gallop. Those who resisted the Mongols did not face ordinary warfare. They faced extinction. When the Khwarezmian Empire defied him in 1219, the consequences were catastrophic. After the execution of his trade envoy, Genghis Khan unleashed one of the most devastating campaigns in recorded history. Cities that resisted were erased. At Urgench, tens of thousands were slaughtered in cold blood. The methods were methodical, not frenzied. Captives were divided into groups, each Mongol soldier ordered to execute a set number of prisoners. This system ensured no single warrior grew soft with pity. Death was distributed as evenly as rations. Public executions were staged as warnings. Leaders were humiliated before their people. Their deaths prolonged for effect. Some were trampled beneath horses. Others suffocated beneath carpets. A method designed to kill without shedding royal blood, preserving a twisted sense of ritual while ensuring absolute degradation. These spectacles were not random cruelty, they were theater, carefully choreographed to spread panic beyond the battlefield. But Genghis Khan's weapon of terror reached beyond the sword. Sexual violence was woven into the very fabric of conquest. For defeated nobles, death was often swift. For their wives and daughters, survival meant a different form of subjugation. Women were seized as trophies, parceled out among generals and soldiers, or taken into Genghis Khan's own harem. In Mongol strategy, this was more than indulgence. It was policy. By taking the women of conquered elites, the bloodlines of rival clans were broken, their dignity erased, and their lineage absorbed into Mongol dominion. Captured women bore children who were claimed as Mongol heirs, strengthening Genghis Khan's dynastic reach while extinguishing the power of his enemies. The practice was systematic, not incidental. Women's bodies became instruments of political erasure, their autonomy stripped in service of empire. The violation was not hidden but accepted as part of conquest, a reminder to all that resistance would not only cost lives, but also the dignity of future generations. The terror extended to survivors left behind. Cities that submitted were often spared from massacre, but not from humiliation. Populations were forced into servitude, artisans and craftsmen relocated to fuel Mongol ambitions. Entire communities were uprooted, their labor extracted as tribute. Yet even those spared knew that mercy came at the price of subjugation, a fragile gift that could be revoked at the slightest sign of disobedience. And always, behind the devastation, there was calculation. The destruction of a single city was never just punishment, it was a message to the next. At Nishapur, after a Mongol general was killed, vengeance fell upon the entire city. Contemporary accounts describe mass slaughter so total that bones littered the fields for years. Whether the numbers were inflated or not, the horror lay in the fact that survivors across Asia believed them and surrendered before their own walls were breached. In this way, terror became the most efficient Mongol weapon. It conquered not just cities but minds, paralyzing resistance before a battle could begin. To those living under his shadow, Genghis Khan was not merely a conqueror. He was an executioner of nations, a man whose wrath erased entire cultures in days. And yet, he framed his cruelty as divine justice. He declared himself the chosen of the eternal sky, tasked with punishing the arrogant and rewarding submission. For those who obeyed, he could be pragmatic, even generous. For those who resisted, he was merciless. This duality, calculated benevolence paired with unimaginable cruelty, made his power absolute. The people he conquered lived in a constant state of dread, knowing their survival rested not on justice, but on obedience. The legacy of this terror outlived him. His campaigns left behind depopulated cities, fractured dynasties, and generations born of conquest and violation. The Mongol Empire was not built merely on horsemen and arrows, but on the systematic use of fear and the destruction of human dignity as tools of governance. In the Mongol vision of conquest, women were as valuable as livestock and treasure. They were seized, divided, and distributed in the same manner as horses or silk. Yet unlike wealth, their capture carried deeper significance: the destruction of family honor, the erasure of dynasties, and the absorption of bloodlines into Mongol dominion. From the very beginning of Genghis Khan's rise, abduction was more than a byproduct of war. It was his lived experience. His own wife, Börte, had been taken by the Merkit tribe shortly after their marriage. Though he reclaimed her by force, the episode marked him permanently. What had once been a personal humiliation became a justification for systematizing the same cruelty on a continental scale. For him, to take a woman was not only to claim her body, but to conquer her family, her clan, and her people. As Mongol armies swept into Central Asia, Persia, and later China, reports of mass abductions became as widespread as accounts of slaughter. Noblewomen in particular were targeted. To seize a queen, a princess, or the wife of a governor was to strip an enemy's dignity bare. Women of rank were paraded, forced into the Khan's household or into the harems of his sons and generals. In some cases, they were gifted like tribute, their bodies functioning as currency to cement alliances. Chroniclers of the Khwarezmian campaigns recorded the pattern with horror. After the fall of cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand, noble families were divided. Male leaders were executed, suffocated, beheaded, or trampled, while their wives and daughters were catalogued and redistributed. To resist was useless. Women who refused to submit were killed, their deaths serving as further lessons to the living. Survival meant captivity. Persian historian Ada Malik Javani, who documented the Mongol destruction, described how entire households of noblewomen were taken into the Khan's orbit. Some were married off to Mongol leaders, others reduced to concubines. For Genghis Khan himself, the accumulation of women was not hidden, but flaunted. His household became a political institution filled with wives and concubines taken from every corner of his empire. Each woman symbolized a defeated lineage, each child born a reminder that the blood of conquered dynasties now flowed into the veins of Mongol heirs. In China, the pattern repeated. After the Mongol conquest of the Jin dynasty's territories, women of the court were seized. Emperors' widows, princesses, and concubines were stripped of their status, forced to serve in Mongol households. Records tell of Chinese noblewomen compelled into marriages that erased dynastic claims. By binding them to Mongol men, Genghis Khan ensured that rival families could no longer rise with legitimacy. Bloodlines that had once defined kingdoms were diluted, absorbed into the empire, leaving behind broken genealogies. This practice was not random violence. It was institutionalized policy. Where Mongol men spread their seed, they also spread legitimacy, creating heirs who could lay claim to conquered territories by blood. For common soldiers, access to captured women was both reward and motivation, reinforcing loyalty to the Khan. Sexual violence became a sanctioned act, a weapon wielded not in shadows but under the authority of empire. For the women themselves, captivity was a life sentence of humiliation. Their choices stripped away, their identities erased, they became instruments of political transformation. The trauma endured by these women rarely appeared in the chronicles written by men, but its consequences are visible in the genealogies of Asia. Descendants of Genghis Khan and his sons spread across continents, their lineages intertwined with women who had no say in their fate. Perhaps most chilling is the scale. Genetic studies today suggest that as many as 16 million men across the world carry a Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan. Behind this legacy lies not a tale of romance but of systematic sexual domination. It is the biological evidence of policy-driven abduction, encoded into the very fabric of populations. The psychological impact was as profound as the physical. To see a wife or daughter carried away was the ultimate humiliation for noble families. It signaled not only defeat, but erasure. The memory of dynasties crumbled when their women were absorbed into the households of conquerors. For surviving men, the destruction was total. Their lines ended, their names forgotten, their women reborn as symbols of Mongol power. This was conquest through intimacy, conquest that reached into the most personal parts of human life. Where Mongol armies burned fields and leveled cities, their leaders ensured that the very bloodlines of their enemies could not survive intact. The empire advanced not only by the destruction of bodies, but by the forced creation of new ones. Children born from violence, carrying the name of the conqueror rather than the conquered. The abduction of women as war policy reveals the deepest horror of Mongol conquest, that domination was not confined to the battlefield, but entered the household, the womb, and the generations that followed. It was conquest that reshaped humanity itself. In the hierarchy of Mongol conquest, no one was beyond violation, but for princesses and noble women, the cruelty was magnified. Their fate was not only personal suffering but public degradation, intended to humiliate their people and extinguish dynastic pride. Where soldiers were slain quickly and common women distributed, royal women were marked for slower, more deliberate forms of torment. The Mongols understood that rulers drew their legitimacy from family lines. To seize a princess was to seize the heart of a dynasty, and to break her was to break the spirit of a people. It was a form of symbolic warfare, one carried out on women's bodies in ways both horrifying and unforgettable. One of the most chilling examples occurred in the Western Xia Kingdom, a Tangut dynasty on China's northwestern frontier. After years of uneasy alliance and betrayal, the Xia ruler submitted his daughter to Genghis Khan in marriage. To many, it seemed an act of diplomacy, a princess offered as a bridge between peoples. But when Genghis Khan fell ill during his campaign against the Tanguts in 1227, he blamed the princess herself, accusing her of treachery. Upon his deathbed orders, she was executed in a manner reserved for traitors buried alive. A royal bride, reduced to nothing more than a symbol of vengeance, her body entombed beneath the soil of the very empire her family had hoped to placate. In Persia, the cruelty was no less devastating. After the Mongols destroyed the Khwarezmian dynasty, noble women of the court were singled out. Contemporary sources speak of public humiliation, women of rank stripped, assaulted, and paraded before survivors. These were not hidden crimes, but spectacles designed to shatter the last pride of a conquered nation. For those who watched, the message was unambiguous. Their rulers' daughters could be disgraced at will, their most sacred family bonds desecrated before their eyes. Some princesses were forced into unwanted marriages, their bodies used to bind submission with horror. Marriages arranged by the Mongols rarely brought stability. Instead, they reinforced the imbalance of power, reminding all parties that the woman was not a bride but a hostage. These unions often ended with murder. If the political use of a princess expired, so too did her life. Accounts tell of strangulations carried out in silence, the cord tightening around royal throats as dynasties collapsed into dust. Even when not killed outright, royal women endured fates meant to erase their very identity. In Central Asia, daughters of emirs and sultans were given as concubines to common soldiers, a deliberate insult to their families. To see a princess reduced to servitude beneath men of lower rank was to witness a dynasty's prestige annihilated. In some cases, women were forced to serve in the households of their own people's conquerors, living reminders of their family's failure. What made these acts particularly cruel was their ritual nature. Violence against common women was widespread in Mongol conquests, but against princesses it became symbolic theater. Each mutilation, each act of humiliation, was staged to send a message: no crown, no ancestry, no divine mandate could shield against Mongol wrath. In the act of violation, centuries of royal sanctity were desecrated in moments. Persian chroniclers describe noblewomen mutilated, noses cut, ears severed, before execution their disfigured bodies cast aside as warnings. Others were raped in front of husbands, fathers, or subjects, the act itself weaponized to annihilate the dignity of men as much as women. By using princesses as instruments of humiliation, the Mongols turned intimate cruelty into political warfare. The memory of these atrocities persisted long after the bodies were gone. Survivors carried stories of princesses strangled, buried alive, or publicly degraded. For societies that revered royal women as almost sacred, these acts struck at the core of cultural identity. Dynasties that had once traced their legitimacy through noble blood now bore scars of shame, their women's suffering etched into collective memory. Perhaps the greatest horror lies not only in the individual acts, but in their deliberate purpose. These were not random explosions of cruelty. They were targeted strategies designed to dismantle dynasties from within. The torture of princesses was the execution of politics through humiliation, stripping away the sanctity of royal blood so thoroughly that resistance seemed futile. The Mongols' treatment of noblewomen revealed a grim truth about empire power was not secured solely through armies and conquests. It was secured through the destruction of symbols. And in the 12th and 13th centuries, few symbols carried greater weight than the body of a princess. When Mongol armies stormed a city, survival did not end with surrender. For the women left behind, conquest began anew. Beyond the slaughter of men and the destruction of walls, there came a second wave of violence, the mass seizure and systematic violation of women. It was not random brutality, nor the secret indulgence of soldiers. It was structured, ritualized, and central to Mongol rule. The chronicles of the Khwarezmian campaigns in the early 13th century describe horrors that still echo centuries later. In Bukhara, once a jewel of Islamic scholarship, its fall marked the beginning of widespread humiliation. Noblewomen of the emir's court were singled out, raped publicly to demonstrate the futility of resistance. Common women fared no better, seized in massy and divided among soldiers as plunder. For days, the city became a stage of mass violation, the screams of women a soundtrack to Mongol victory. At Nishapur, the fate of women intertwined with one of the bloodiest massacres in recorded history. After a Mongol general was killed, vengeance fell with apocalyptic force. Tens of thousands were executed, and survivors faced degradation of another kind. Persian chroniclers record how women were dragged into captivity, distributed in groups, and forced into the beds of those who had murdered their families. Here, rape was not an accident of war. It was the continuation of conquest, domination of the womb as well as the sword. The Mongols transformed sexual violence into a weapon of psychological warfare. By subjecting women to public humiliation, they shattered the honor of entire communities. In cultures where female chastity was bound to family pride, these acts destroyed not only individuals but the collective identity of a people. Men who survived were forced to witness the violation of their wives and daughters, left powerless, stripped of dignity in ways that death could not achieve. The practice was so widespread that it became an expectation of conquest. Captured women were divided as spoils ranked by beauty, age, and lineage. High-born women were reserved for Mongol leaders, while commoners were distributed among soldiers. Sexual slavery became institutionalized, a form of tribute extracted from conquered populations. Chroniclers note that even women of religious orders were not spared. Nuns, Priestesses and women sheltered in mosques were dragged into the open, their sacred spaces desecrated as Mongol soldiers violated them on holy ground. These acts carried deliberate symbolism: no god, no temple, no law could protect against Mongol will. Faith itself was humiliated through the violation of its daughters. This system of mass enslavement reached far beyond immediate conquest. Women were transported across the empire, absorbed into households, harems, and barracks. In some cases, they were forced to march alongside armies, serving as both captives and laborers, subjected to nightly assaults that blurred the line between wife, concubine, and prisoner. Their identities were erased, their bodies reduced to reminders of Mongol dominance. The horror was amplified by its ritualized nature. The seizure of women followed predictable patterns: the execution of male leaders, the plundering of wealth, and then the distribution of women as spoils. This cycle repeated from Central Asia to Persia, from Rus principalities to northern China. Survivors understood that resistance meant not only death but the violation of their families. In many cases, cities surrendered preemptively, hoping to spare their women. But even surrender offered little protection. Submission only changed the scale of the violence, not its certainty. The biological consequences of this policy became visible within a single generation. Children born of these unions carried the blood of conquerors, their identities severed from their maternal lineages. Genetic studies today reveal the scale of this legacy. Millions of men across Eurasia carry the genetic imprint of Genghis Khan and his descendants. Each strand of DNA is a silent record of conquest written through the bodies of women who had no choice. For the women themselves, history offers little voice. Chronicles record numbers, not testimonies. Yet through fragments we glimpse the horror. Persian writers speaking of mothers torn from children, Chinese records describing noblewomen reduced to concubines of low-ranking soldiers, Russian annals mourning daughters carried into endless captivity. Behind each number lies a silent story, a life broken and consumed by empire. The Mongols saw in these acts not shame but power. By turning mass rape into policy, they enforced submission more effectively than any treaty. Cities knew that if they resisted, their women would suffer a fate worse than death. Terror spread not only from executions and massacres, but from the memory of violated bodies, carried in whispers from city to city. This was conquest etched into the most intimate sphere of human life. The Mongol Empire was built on violence, but its most enduring weapon was not always the sword. It was lineage. Genghis Khan, who rose from obscurity to dominate the known world, carried a conviction that his blood was chosen by destiny. And unlike his conquests of land and cities, this was not an empire of walls and borders. It was an empire of flesh. To ensure his dominance would outlast his lifetime, he spread his seed as ruthlessly as his armies spread fire. Historians estimate that Genghis Khan may have fathered hundreds of children. Genetic research, examining the Y chromosome lineage of men across Central Asia, reveals that nearly 16 million males alive today, about 0.5% of the world's male population, can trace their ancestry back to one man who lived in the 12th or 13th century. The evidence points overwhelmingly to Genghis Khan. His empire was not just carved into maps, it was written into human DNA. But this genetic legacy was not born of romance, nor even of chance. It was the result of deliberate sexual conquest. Defeated rulers often saw their daughters taken into the Khan's household. Noblewomen from Persia, China, Korea, and Central Asia were absorbed into his expanding harem, not merely as wives or concubines, but as political hostages and instruments of humiliation. When a ruler's daughter bore the Khan's child, her bloodline no longer belonged to her people. It belonged to Mongolia. The Khan had 4 official wives, but beyond them were countless concubines, slave girls, and war captives. Women captured in battle were distributed among Mongol generals, yet the most beautiful and high-born were reserved for Genghis himself. For him, sexual possession was not private indulgence, it was policy. It symbolized his right to dominate every facet of a conquered world. A ruler's defeat was not complete until his wife or daughter had been claimed by the Khan. The humiliation was profound. In Khwarezm, where entire cities were put to the sword, noble daughters were forced into Mongol households. In China, the daughters of defeated dynasties were paraded as gifts for the Khan. Even in death, the practice continued. The Tangut royal family, destroyed after their refusal to aid the Khan in his final campaign, saw their princesses given as trophies before being killed in acts of ritual punishment. The violation of women was inseparable from the destruction of states. To Genghis Khan, women were also wombs of empire. By impregnating noble daughters, he ensured that rival dynasties would be extinguished. Their heirs would be Mongol, their loyalty irreversibly redirected. Bloodlines that had stood for centuries were diluted, overwritten, and erased. In this way, conquest entered the most private sphere of life reproduction. The battlefield did not end when the swords were sheathed. It continued in the forced births of children destined to carry Mongol blood. This systematic sexual domination also reinforced the hierarchy of the empire. Generals and loyal warriors were rewarded with women, just as they were rewarded with horses, land, and loot. Entire harems moved with the Mongol court, filled with women from every conquered nation. For the men, it was a sign of privilege and favor. For the women, it was captivity, often ending in pregnancies that tied them irrevocably to their conquerors. The consequences of this policy echo into modern times. In the steppes, among Kazakh Kyrgyz and Mongol populations, oral traditions remember Genghis Khan not only as a warrior but as a progenitor. In some regions, lineage traced back to the Khan remains a source of pride, yet the human reality behind those bloodlines is one of coercion, exploitation, and trauma. The millions of descendants alive today are silent witnesses to centuries of forced unions that began under Mongol conquest. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this legacy is its endurance. Armies burn, cities fall, empires collapse, but blood persists. The genetic mark of Genghis Khan is scattered across nations that once feared his armies. From the rivers of China to the deserts of Central Asia, every living descendant is an unwitting reminder that domination was not only written in chronicles of war, but in the bodies of women who had no choice. When the world imagines the palaces of the Mongol Khans, the vision is often one of splendor, silk banners fluttering, golden cups brimming with kumis, vast halls filled with music, dancers, and the spoils of conquest. But for many of the women who lived behind those walls, the reality was far darker. The palace, for them, was not a sanctuary of wealth and comfort. It was a prison, where defiance was punished in ways as brutal as any battlefield slaughter. The Mongol court was a world where women had no refuge from cruelty. Those taken into the Khan's household, whether noble brides, concubines, or slaves, were expected to serve unquestioningly. Failure, resistance, or even the faintest trace of defiance could bring punishment, not only swift, but terrifyingly creative. The very same rulers who orchestrated massacres of cities often turned their appetite for dominance inward, turning women into playthings for sadistic amusement. Historical accounts describe women stripped naked before the court, paraded as warnings, their humiliation staged as spectacle. Branding was another punishment, searing flesh with heated iron, leaving scars that declared permanent ownership. The cruelty was not random, but theatrical, designed to strip dignity and instill fear. Each act reminded the women that they were not individuals, but property, bodies to be broken at will. One of the most infamous punishments within the Mongol court was suffocation. Women accused of betrayal or disobedience could be wrapped tightly in carpets or felt mats, rolled until their breath was crushed from their lungs. The act was both execution and entertainment. Unlike beheadings or hangings, it left no visible blood, sparing the sanctity of Mongol superstition while intensifying the agony of the victim. Those who survived the ordeal bore lifelong injuries. Those who did not were simply disposed of, their absence barely noted. Mutilation was another terror. Ears, noses, and even breasts were cut away, disfiguring women permanently. These mutilations were punishments but also messages, ensuring that the victim could never again be seen as desirable, condemning her to shame and isolation within the court. The body itself became a canvas of power, scarred by the will of the Khan and his attendants. Accounts also suggest that women were sometimes forced into sadistic games, bound, whipped, or used as objects of mockery during drunken revels. They existed at the mercy of intoxicated warriors. A noble daughter who once carried dignity and grace could find herself treated as little more than an animal for laughter. For the Mongol elite, these displays reaffirmed their control. The greater the suffering of the helpless, the greater the power of the conqueror. Even the wives of rivals, when taken into the Mongol household, were not spared. Their presence was a constant reminder of their family's defeat. Some were paraded in court only to be violated, beaten, or executed if they showed resistance. To possess them was to erase their lineage, to turn a queen into a slave. These women bore the crushing weight of both political humiliation and personal torment, their suffering erased from chronicles but whispered through oral traditions that survived. The paradox of the Mongol palace was staggering. Silk curtains, jeweled goblets, musicians playing softly in the background, and in the shadows, the screams of women punished for the slightest disobedience. It was a space where opulence cloaked brutality, where the fragrance of incense mingled with the stench of burned flesh. The palace existed as both the crown jewel of empire and the cage of its captives. For the women who lived within those walls, survival meant silence, obedience, and invisibility. A misplaced glance, a whispered complaint, or a hint of defiance could cost everything. Yet even perfect submission could not guarantee safety. The Mongol court's cruelty was arbitrary, its punishments often inflicted not because of crime, but because of whim. The battlefield massacres of the Mongols are remembered with horror, but behind palace walls another massacre occurred. One not of bodies en masse, but of lives lived in constant terror. It was a different kind of slaughter of dignity, of identity, of hope. For centuries, the figure of Genghis Khan has loomed over history as the ultimate symbol of conquest and empire. His armies annihilated entire cities, his empire stretched across continents, and his name struck terror from China to Europe. Yet, while the battlefield horrors are well documented, the private world of the Khan carried cruelties of its own. His wives and concubines, often taken by force from defeated tribes and rival rulers, lived lives that were gilded on the outside but terrifyingly fragile beneath the surface. Marriage in the Mongol court was not born of love, but of strategy, power, and dominance. Each wife represented not a bond but a conquest. Some were daughters of defeated Khans, given as spoils of war. Others were stolen from their husbands, forced into the household of the conqueror. To be chosen was no blessing. It meant becoming both a symbol of subjugation and a prisoner within the gilded cage of the Khan's tent. The number of women under Genghis Khan's command was staggering. He maintained not only primary wives, but concubines and attendants taken from campaigns that swept across Asia. But despite their numbers, none of these women possessed security. Their value lay in one thing only: their ability to bear sons who could extend the Khan's dynasty. A wife who failed to conceive, or whose child was female, was of little worth in the eyes of empire. Even those who did give birth were never safe. If a woman's child grew into a rival or appeared to challenge the Khan's political plans, her life could be abruptly cut short. Suspicion was enough to seal her fate. Whispers of betrayal, rumors of infidelity, or simply the Khan's shifting moods could condemn her to execution. In the Mongol court, death often came without warning, swift, public, and absolute. Historical accounts describe how concubines were discarded when their youth faded, their bodies worn from years of childbearing. A woman who had once been paraded in jewels might suddenly be stripped of her dignity, cast aside, or sent away to live in obscurity. Others were executed outright, not because of crimes, but because they were no longer useful to the ambitions of the Khan. In this world, affection was fleeting, loyalty one-sided, and survival depended on silence and submission. Some wives suffered fates worse than abandonment. Those accused of disloyalty could be executed in gruesome fashion, their deaths staged as warnings to others. Strangulation, suffocation in carpets, or mutilation became the silent punishments of palace life. And unlike soldiers killed on the battlefield, their deaths left no honor, no recognition, only terror for those who remained behind. Even queens of high birth, once honored for their lineage, were not untouchable. A bride taken from a rival clan could become the Khan's favored companion one day, only to be reduced to a liability the next. To possess them was to erase the pride of their families, to discard them was to remind all that even noble blood offered no shield from Mongol cruelty. The irony of this system is stark. The women of the Khan's household were central to the continuation of his empire, yet entirely disposable as individuals. They carried the heirs who would inherit vast stretches of the known world, but their personal survival meant nothing. Their wombs were prized, their lives worthless. What makes these stories even more chilling is their silence in historical records. The voices of the concubines rarely survive. What remains are fragments, whispers from foreign chroniclers, second-hand accounts from rival cultures, and scars in oral traditions that hint at the suffering buried beneath the empire's triumphs. The grandeur of Genghis Khan is remembered, but the misery of his wives and concubines has been almost erased. Behind the walls of the palace and the silk curtains of the royal tent, women lived in a constant state of dread. To wake each day was to gamble with fate. Would they be called upon to share the Khan's bed, or would they be summoned for judgment? Would they nurse an heir, or would they be condemned as useless? For them, life was a series of fragile chances. Every breath borrowed against the wrath of the conqueror. The world remembers Genghis Khan as the father of nations, a man who may have millions of descendants alive today. Yet for many of the women forced into his household, he was not a father, but a destroyer. Their stories remain buried in shadows, their cries unheard by the chroniclers of empire. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the terror he unleashed upon the world did not end. His death marked not closure, but continuity. The empire he carved out of blood and fire was held together not only by military genius, but by a culture of domination, one that treated women as spoils, tools, and trophies. The next generations inherited his empire, his armies, and his methods, but above all they inherited his cruelty. Across Eurasia, from the steppes of Mongolia to the cities of China, Persia, and Russia, the same pattern repeated conquest was not only a seizure of land, but of bodies. Women remained central to this machine of domination. The fate of captives was decided not by their own will, but by the whims of princes who had grown up in the shadow of their father's brutality. Ögedei and the normalization of sexual terror. Genghis Khan's chosen successor, his son Ögedei, presided over an empire that stretched from Korea to Eastern Europe. Chroniclers describe him as a ruler less disciplined than his father, prone to indulgence and excess. Yet when it came to women, he did not deviate from the precedent set. Ögedei expanded the harem system, taking noble women from conquered lands into his possession. To him and to the generals who served under him, sexual access was not privilege but policy. Persian chroniclers noted that women of defeated families were offered to Mongol princes as rewards. This was not private lust, it was public humiliation. By claiming the daughters and wives of defeated rulers, the Mongols announced that dynasties had been erased and bloodlines polluted. What had been shocking under Genghis became normalized under Ögedei. His court institutionalized the idea that women's bodies were imperial property, no different from livestock or land. The cruelty had become tradition. Kublai Khan and the Chinese court. When Kublai Khan founded the Yuan dynasty in China, he styled himself not as a barbarian conqueror, but as a legitimate emperor. He adopted Chinese rituals, patronized Confucian scholars, and projected an image of order. But behind the polished surface of his rule, Mongol traditions of domination persisted. Chinese sources record the forced marriages of noble women to Mongol officials, even when these unions violated Confucian ideals of family honor and continuity. Widows were compelled to remarry Mongols, erasing their ancestral ties. The violation was not only physical but cultural. Families who had guarded their lineage for centuries were forced to watch their daughters absorbed into foreign bloodlines. In Kublai's court, concubines filled the palaces, many of them unwilling captives taken from Central Asia or the southern Chinese territories. They lived in luxury but under chains of fear. A smile or a frown could determine whether they were elevated to favor or discarded like refuse. The cruelty was more subtle than the battlefield rapes of earlier generations, but no less devastating. The Ilkhanate and Persia's nightmare nowhere. Perhaps did Mongol cruelty toward women leave deeper scars than in Persia. Under the Ilkhans, Genghis Khan's descendants who ruled from the mid-13th century, Persian society was reshaped under the shadow of sexual domination. Persian chronicles recount case after case of noble families whose daughters were seized by Mongol officials. Some were forced into harems, others given away as gifts to cement alliances. Sexual humiliation became a form of governance. To resist was to invite annihilation, not only for the woman herself but for her entire family. One Ilkhan, a Bukhara, was said to have kept hundreds of concubines, but beyond his personal indulgence, the practice served as political theater. Women taken into the court became symbols of Mongol dominance, their very presence a reminder that no family, no matter how noble or devout, could shield its daughters from violation. The chronicler Wasaf wrote with anguish of Persian women, dragged from the veil into the hands of the unclean, their fates a reflection of the empire's contempt for Persian honor. Each abduction was both personal tragedy and collective punishment. The Golden Horde and Russia's subjugation in the West, the Mongol legacy of cruelty passed into the Golden Horde, which ruled over the Russian principalities. Here, too, women became targets of domination. Reports describe villages where Mongol raiders seized wives and daughters, sparing men only long enough to witness the violation before slaughter. Russian chronicles spoke of the shame of our women as an enduring wound. Noble daughters were forced into marriages with Mongol leaders, binding Russia's ruling families into submission through humiliation. Others were taken as concubines to the Khans of the steppe. Even within Christian monasteries, nuns were not spared, their bodies reduced to offerings of conquest. This sexual terror was not a side effect of Mongol rule, it was a pillar of it. By assaulting the most intimate sanctities of family and faith, the horde ensured that resistance was broken not only on the battlefield, but within the heart of society. A legacy written in bloodlines, perhaps the most enduring testament to this inheritance of cruelty, lies not in chronicles but in genetics. Modern studies reveal that a staggering proportion of men across Eurasia, nearly 1 in every 200, carry a Y chromosome traceable to Genghis Khan and his descendants. This is not a record of love or union, but of conquest. Each forced marriage, each concubine taken into the court, each widow compelled to bear children for a Mongol master contributed to this genetic empire. Generations of women were reduced to vessels, their bloodlines absorbed, their identities erased. For the Mongols, this was victory, to dominate not only territory, but the very future of human inheritance. Conclusion: Empire of Shadows. The death of Genghis Khan did not end the reign of terror. Instead, it codified it. His heirs, Ögedei, Kublai, the Ilkhans, the Golden Horde, carried his practices forward, embedding sexual cruelty into the very fabric of Mongol imperial governance. Women were never safe, whether behind palace walls or in conquered cities. They lived as captives, concubines, or instruments of humiliation. Their suffering was the silent foundation of the empire's glory. The inheritance of cruelty ensured that the Mongol Empire was not only written in blood, but in the broken bodies of countless women. Its shadow stretches across history, a reminder that behind every banner of conquest lies a ledger of human despair. When the Mongol Empire finally fractured, its armies disbanded, and its rulers absorbed into local dynasties, the scars it left behind did not fade. The devastation Genghis Khan unleashed upon the cities of Asia was not only measured in ruins and corpses, but in the silent anguish carried within survivors, particularly women. For them, conquest was not an event limited to a season of war. It was a wound that bled across generations. Unlike toppled walls which could be rebuilt, the psychic ruin of Mongol brutality endured in the flesh, memory, and even the bloodlines of entire peoples. Trauma became inheritance, and in villages from Persia to China, whispers of shame and grief survived long after the horsemen rode away. The aftermath of sexual conquest: historians often calculate Mongol devastation in numbers: millions slaughtered, kingdoms destroyed, cities erased. Yet what was less easily counted were the women broken in spirit, whose suffering lingered quietly in households and family lines. Survivors of mass rape carried their pain in silence, often blamed or shunned within their own communities. Children born of conquest embodied both survival and humiliation. constant reminders of domination, seen as neither fully Mongol nor fully accepted by their mother's people. The Mongols had weaponized sexuality to fracture societies, and its effects continued to corrode unity long after their empire splintered. Families bore the burden of dishonor. Dynasties remembered the humiliation of seeing noble daughters turned into Mongol broodmares. The violence reached beyond the battlefield. It penetrated memory itself. Oral histories and cultural memory across Central Asia, the Middle East, and China, stories endured. They were whispered by grandmothers to granddaughters. Warnings, laments, half-veiled recollections of the time when the horsemen came. In some traditions, women spoke not of battles, but of the night the doors of their homes were broken down. Folk songs and laments carried the weight of captivity, forced concubinage, and the fear that no sanctuary existed against Mongol riders. Even centuries later, in regions once under Mongol dominion, the memory of their cruelty persisted in proverbs and cautionary tales. The Mongol was not remembered only as a warrior, but as a violator. In cultural imagination, the figure of the mounted invader embodied not just death, but dishonor, the theft of dignity from women and families alike. Generational trauma. Modern psychology gives a name to what those survivors carried: generational trauma. The Mongol policy of sexual violence created entire bloodlines forged in coercion. Many communities never spoke openly of it, yet the shame was transmitted silently through silence, avoidance, and social stigma. A woman taken by Mongols often became untouchable within her own people, stripped not only of freedom but of belonging. And yet, the empire celebrated this cruelty. Genghis Khan's supposed descendants, numbering in the millions today, stand as biological proof of conquest. Where the Khan saw his seat of empire, countless women saw only violation. Their forced maternity turned into the foundation of dynasties. For them, motherhood was not choice but sentence. Civilizations shaped by fear. The psychological impact of Mongol cruelty shaped entire societies. Cities learned not just to fear Mongol armies, but to internalize submission as survival. Tales of women mutilated, raped, or humiliated into death became lessons: surrender quickly or suffer degradation beyond imagination. The legacy was compliance, born not from diplomacy, but from terror engraved into the minds of generations. Even long after Mongol banners no longer flew, the echo of their violence continued to shape cultural attitudes toward women, honor, and shame. In some regions, strict codes of female chastity hardened, forged in the memory of violation. In others, distrust of outsiders deepened, rooted in centuries-old scars of forced intimacy. A legacy beyond bones and ruins. Historians often marvel at the Mongol Empire's scope, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But its truest legacy may not be in borders, trade routes, or even the reshaping of Eurasia's political order. It lies in the invisible realm of memory, trauma, and identity. The Khan's empire ended, but the psychic wounds he inflicted did not. For countless women, their stories were never recorded in chronicles. Their pain was not preserved in parchment, but in the trembling voices of descendants who could not forget. The Mongols left behind roads, empires, and bloodlines, yes, but they also left behind shadows, unhealed wounds that shaped how communities saw themselves, how they remembered their past, and how they guarded against future invaders. The story of Mongol conquest, then, is not only one of armies and cities, but of women, and of the psychological violence that endured long after the last horse galloped across the steppe. It is a story of silence, shame, and survival, written not on maps but into the hidden corners of human memory. And in those memories, Genghis Khan still rides,